thanks for coming. Why don't you come and join us here at the table? As Paul said, I've been teaching here at the university in different areas, places, and ways for about 14 years now. But the special section of speech that I used to teach would be a room full of 25 or 30 international students with all different accents and all different expectations about what was going to happen. And of course, everybody who has to take public speaking in college hates it. So that's one dynamic from the very beginning. And secondly, my job, I always felt, was not just to help them pass the course, but to be able to communicate in a public speaking setting in English when English was difficult for them and the audience had completely different expectations and language barriers. So I did my master's thesis on this, on intercultural communication and what is really behind human communication process and what are the devices and little tricks that we can use to support our spoken language so that if we do have accents or speak English differently, we can still get the message across even without those language problems. So that's what we're going to talk about today. The way I've got it structured is I'm going to talk for the first 30 minutes or so to give you some background theory and information. And then I'm going to open it up for questions, or if you have got special cases or situations that you're dealing with at the university, I'd be happy to talk about those. And I've also put my business cards out on the table so that if you don't get time here today because you have to rush off for class or whatever, take my business card and I'd be happy to do email or phone calls with you and help with any kind of a situation you might have that you want to talk through for some ideas. All right? So everybody ready to start? Now, Hugo, please come join us. We have a mixture of people here today. Some of you are professors here at the university. Some of you are teaching assistants. Some of you are volunteers working with the business English students. This is one of our IPD graduates who has just finished the business English program and is learning to communicate in English. So, all right, before we begin, the topic today are the joys and challenges of working with international students. So before we begin, I want everybody to take one of these green cards. And on one side, I want you to write down something positive, a benefit, or something you have really enjoyed by engaging with a person from another culture or another country. Okay, so one side will be what is something that you have enjoyed, or a benefit that you have enjoyed by engaging with international people. On the other side, you're going to write down one frustration, or one problem, or one miscommunication you experienced when you try to work with international people. Okay, so one side is the good and one side is the difficult. And just make a note of your ideas and experiences. You know what, something I forgot to ask you about is, do we have a remote control for the screen, or do you want me to walk over here and go like this? That's all right. Oh. Yeah, thank you. The first rule in public speaking is always go early and learn to use your equipment. If I wander out of view of your camera, feel free to give me
good.
some body language signals.
Yep, help, just do whatever you need to do.
We're going to use it right now. Okay, so you've had a couple minutes to think about the topic in your own life experience. And one thing I want to mention to you is, as I present, I try to role model the techniques that I have found work really, really well with diverse cultural audiences. And one of the techniques is to give people context from which to understand the conversation that's going to occur. So this little activity that we just did within a classroom would be called a set or setup activity. It basically prepares the listeners for listening because they have some idea of what the topic, the context, and the words are going to be. So it's very simple and it can be very subtle. Students don't even have to know you're doing it, but it prepares the audience for listening. Okay? And it engages them with their own experience. So I want to hear just a couple of your comments. Would anybody be willing to share what you enjoy or what benefits you have experienced by working with international people? Anyone? Karen.
Learning about life in other parts of the world.
Okay. How many of you have experienced that? Others have that? Okay. Val.
That was almost exactly mine. Having the opportunity to see the world through someone else's eyes.
Okay, good. Other things?
Just appreciating diversity and how all of us are unique based on our cultural background.
And this is one of the amazing things of the world. Don't you
Very.
think? Every human is unique, and yet we all have these commonalities. And the more differences we bounce against, the more we realize our common human.
Before I worked at UNO, I was also a student at UNO where I got my bachelor and my master's. And I lived on campus for 6 years as an international student. And that was one of the things that really gave me that joy. There was a point where all of my roommates were all from different parts of the world, from Russia, from Japan, and me from Liberia, and it was just so unique. We celebrated our birthdays with different food and different gifts. It was one of the joyous times of my life at
Yes.
UNO.
Okay. So I think the battery's dead. I think one of the things that we have to realize here at the university is that our job, of course, is taking young people and preparing them to go out into the world to do their careers or their jobs, no matter what their interests are. But more importantly, we're teaching them some basic understandings of life that they will carry with them through their whole lives. So for the international students who are coming here, they benefit tremendously by learning English, by understanding American culture, and by meeting people from all over the world, such as your experience in your dormitory. But furthermore, you're getting people in your classes who may be from a small farm town, who have never seen anybody who's not Caucasian. They have maybe never heard a foreign accent, and they're coming to college, and for their first time in their lives, they're having to learn how to communicate interculturally and how to be a little more tolerant and open of other places in the world. And I just can't emphasize enough to you the importance of what we're doing here. Every single job, every single person coming through these doors is going to be in a position where they are operating on a global basis. Whether you realize it or not, your customers, your employees, your vendors, maybe even your boss, may be from a completely different place than you are and may speak completely differently. And if we don't get used to doing that while we're in college, it's going to be much harder to do that in the workplace. And it causes a lot of problems in the workplace. And a few of us sitting here, Lisa and I and Steve all used to work at First Data, small company grown big. We weren't prepared for it when it happened. Nowadays, we've got to prepare everybody for it. So if you have American students in your classroom and they are struggling with interacting with internationals as well, remind them this is where we learn the basic skills to help us in the future. Okay, so now let's flip your card over. Tell me about a couple of the challenges, issues, or problems that you have had when you have been trying to communicate cross-culturally, someone who's different than you are. Okay, Val?
Well, I want to paraphrase this by saying I deal with both international students and international professionals. So I'm not just picking on students.
Okay.
Lack of orientation in basic business protocol.
we're going to talk about that because from Val's and my perspective, punctuality is important because we come from a Western culture. We're going to compare that in a little bit to different time orientations that people in the world have and see how those collide. What other examples do we have?
Language barrier and accent. And it was very frustrating for me because I think the Western world misinterprets accent as not having the ability to speak eloquently. And we have to know all of the countries our students come from. I am from Liberia. From the day I started to speak as a kid, I spoke, learned, and wrote English. And so when I enrolled at UNO, the first thing I was told was to take ESL classes. I'm like, why am I taking ESL classes? And they felt that it was appropriate for me because I have an accent, although we communicate very clearly. And I said, no, I'm not taking ESL classes. I went to the university in Liberia. I graduated from high school in Liberia. I am not taking ESL. And so they said, okay, we have the English composition, the test or whatever. I said, bring it on. And so they gave me the test, and they were like, oh, you scored so high, you don't have to take the English introductory classes. I said, but what were you taking? I told you I'm from Liberia. So it's just frustrating where, you know, we have put all of our students in one box.
Yeah.
Because we had an accent or whatever, but we have to be very knowledgeable about the country that these students come from so that we'll be able to work with them effectively.
There are thousands of ways that English is spoken in the world, and not everybody sounds like they grew up in Nebraska. So this is an important lesson that we learn. Other frustrations or challenges that you've had communicating?
I think my frustration is more critical of myself,
Mhm.
and that is the tendency to use words that really are slang, that are not legitimate. It's very hard to, you have to be conscious of breaking yourself of using some words that you can fall back on very casually.
Yes.
Because I wouldn't want the person I was working with from another country to think that was appropriate.
Yes.
Because it really, in some cases I would catch myself and say, no, I don't want them to speak like that. So that's been my
How
frustration.
many of you who teach here at the university sometimes have a hard time even understanding the conversation that the American kids have? Because of the slang, the abbreviated way that they talk about things. There may be cultural references, music or something that, I know I couldn't understand my teenager for years. He's finally old enough now and beginning to be able to talk to him again. But, okay, so those are all language issues. But today what we really want to talk about are things that go on in the classroom beyond just the assumption that they have an accent, therefore it's hard for me to understand them. I have an accent, therefore it's hard for my students to understand me. It goes beyond that. So there are small things that happen, and some of these are my own experience, and some of them are from when I did this seminar last year for the 40 teachers that teach the public speaking class to the incoming freshmen. Lots and lots of international students coming through that program. These are some of the things the teachers said that are confusing. They will talk one-on-one with an international student, and the student will nod and smile at them, and they'll think everything is fine, and then they will leave the room, and the problem still exists. And I myself have lived in Japan a couple of times, and Germany and Denmark, and one of the things I found working with Asian students is that sometimes they smile when they're nervous. They smile to show they hear you. The smile and the nodding does not necessarily mean they understand what you're saying. So this is how we can sometimes misread body language. Non-native speakers will sometimes be hesitant to speak out in class because they hear you ask the question, but it's going to take them some thinking time before they can answer it. And if they are one of a few in the room, they may be too shy to speak their English in front of everybody. Which is why my special section of public speaking, where they were all from somewhere else, really helped them calm down and be able to speak out with confidence because everybody had the same issues. I've just found that between teaching the American students and teaching all international students, there are so many more misunderstandings, so many more hoaxes, late homework, tests done wrong, even on the darn evaluation at the end of the session, they've got their answers flipped. They meant to say you were very good and they circled the 0. I mean, just so many little things that cause problems. So I think that's just part of the game, and you just have to be prepared and figure out what to do about it. But it gets more serious than that. Because of some of these small day-to-day communication issues, you can get into some things that can be fairly serious in terms of trying to help get them through college. And this is where we are talking about students who do not have good listening comprehension skills. They're attending your class, which is primarily lecture. They can't understand it, and the next thing you know, they stop coming to class because they find that they can read and take the test beautifully. And it's just frustrating for them to sit in class and have to try to listen. A lot of professors have told me that they think the international students have more propensity to cheat. And so I ask them to define what's cheating. Well, I give everybody a homework assignment and they go off and do it together and share their work, their answers with everybody. Oh, well, guess what? If you grew up in China or Africa, where there are 60 elementary school children in the room with one teacher, the teacher does not individualize that instruction, and the only way to keep up is to meet with your friends after class and go back over the information together and keep each other up. It's not perceived as cheating. It's perceived as the way you get your education, the way you get through school. So even things that we think are fairly black and white can sometimes be gray, depending on the background. Some of the difficulties we have in public speaking is if you assign an opening speech, like a how-to speech of something you know well, you see the same topic coming back semester after semester, and pretty soon the slides start to look familiar, and the stories and the anecdotes sound familiar, and it's apparent that this information is just trickling from generation to generation of student because they know what will pass and what will get the grade, and it's just being shared. Okay, so we would call that plagiarism. Again, it's a different approach to getting yourself through college. Some of you may realize if you assign research papers, it's very important. Citations and bibliographies are very important in the American environment. We have strong laws on proprietary information. We respect privacy and individualism. Well, if you grew up in a different country, again, China is an example, proprietary information is group information. The attitude about it is completely different. So it's not like they mean to go out and break our laws or flunk themselves out of college. They just have a completely different perspective on it. So what I find is that working with international students in my classroom, I have to be extremely blunt about what these words mean. You can't just say, don't cheat. You have to say to them, when you get your homework, I want you to do it by yourself every time, unless I tell you to work with a partner. That's a lot more clear. Okay? If you are requesting research, you have to say, you may not cut and paste anything you see on the internet, and even when you rewrite it in your own words, you still have to tell me whose idea it is, and you have to show them how to do that. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about what causes these frustrations. Looking at your green card and thinking about the incidences you've had in your whole life, what do you think caused the problems? Either the miscommunication or maybe huge issues with getting a student through your class. What do you think was the major cause? So let's hear from some other people. None? Any idea? What problem?
My problem is when I first came here, like the speed was to the top.
Mm-hmm.
Really fast, I couldn't catch up.
Okay. And I think whenever we're dealing with accents, speed is an issue because we're just not familiar with it. Okay. Other, do you know what caused any issues that you've seen?
I didn't exactly know what, sorry.
Okay, I need to give her think time. Very common. You be my international student today.
communication.
Okay, and Mary, what is your situation? Are you teaching in Spanish to native Spanish?
No, I'm working in a community center with children and mothers.
Okay.
And we're teaching music, and language is a large barrier right now for
Okay.
the majority of the class time.
All right, so we have language issues, we have speed issues, we have accent issues. Is there anything beyond the spoken word that causes trouble?
I don't have any problems with international students. They're usually my best students.
Okay. Do you have any trouble with the American students?
Yeah, just because the size is bigger. So when you have 30, you can find 2, 3 easy.
Okay.
You have 10, 40 students. I have 10, 40 students in this class now. I have 0 problems. I never had
How
problems.
many of you have had the experience that your international students actually work harder? And despite, if they didn't have any language issues, would be like the best
Actually, I think they're more appreciative of
of the
the
opportunity?
U.S. educational system.
Yeah.
And maybe, not all of you, but
Yeah.
sometimes we take for granted things that are, we grew up with.
What I'd like to do now is I'd like to take you a little bit deeper beyond just the language issues that we've all experienced, and we all know that that's part of it. I'd like to give you some of the other parts. How many of you have traveled to a foreign country or gone to a party where you were the rare person? Everyone else was speaking a language that you did not speak. How many of you have experienced that? Okay. So maybe you recognize, this is one of my favorite cartoons from 25 years ago. This is when you first start working on a language and you're trying to work in that language, this is what it feels like. You have no context, you have no idea what's going on. You walk into a conversation and you hear blah, 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 and then you hear a word that you might recognize, like your name or the word weather or Nebraska, something like that, and then blah, 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 blah. And as you get better at the language, the words start to fill in a little bit more and a little bit more. But that's what it feels like. So we know that those language problems exist, but it's not all that's going on. How many of you are familiar with the human communication model? The idea that we have ideas in our heads, we have to translate them ourselves into words or actions or writing, and then we send that message out from our bodies, and someone else receives it and has to unpackage it and interpret it. And at every single one of these steps, mistakes, mishaps, or miscommunications can occur. So it's not just necessarily the spoken language, it could be the way that you put your thought together is incomprehensible to someone else. It could be the way that they received it and unpackaged it, that's the problem.
It's like the telephone game.
Yes, it is. It's like the telephone game. I mean, I can remember one of my classes, I had 24 students in there, and I told a joke. And 23 of them laughed uproariously. And afterwards, the 24th student came up and told me that I had severely offended her. So my packaging of the message and what I intended to do was like this, but when she unpacked it, it was interpreted totally differently. And that happens in any language, right? Any country, any culture. Well, this is one concept I want you to keep in mind, and that is that when humans are decoding or when they are interpreting what's going on around them, they are using their own personal filters. Just like a coffee filter, it's going to catch some things and keep it, and it's going to let some things just drain away. But these filters are based on culture. They're based on your background experience. They're based on the lessons that your grandma told you when you were a little kid. Everything that's happened to us has created our filters. And we can't help it. When we receive a message through writing, body, or speaking, we unpackage it based on how we see the world. And this is one of those beautiful things. Everybody has a unique perspective on the world. This is one of our biggest problems in communication. Everybody has a unique perspective on the world. That's why 23 people laughed and one person came up to talk to me about how offensive I have been in class. And one of the difficult things about this, because people are not taught specifically about filters, they change cultures, they change countries, or they work with people who are different from themselves. Even a farm kid coming to Omaha is in culture shock, okay? They go to a different culture and they don't realize that those filters are twisting what's happening and what's being said. A major cause of misinterpretation. problems. Now we know we have just basic communication issues. The third thing I want to tell you a little more about, if you're working with internationals, you may or may not have studied any of these concepts before, but in my master's program of intercultural communication, we spent hours looking at these kinds of things. Cultural differences are built into our way of thinking, and we do not realize how much they are controlling our behavior and our interpretation of the world. So let's take, Val was talking to us a little bit earlier about time orientation. Young business people come to the US, and they do not have the same sense of time urgency that we have. This is called time orientation. I never realized how dramatic this was until my first year of teaching for IPD, about 10 years ago. I had a party at my house early in the session to make everybody feel comfortable and develop rapport, because I knew that was important. I said the party was from 7 to 9. It was to be a potluck, international potluck, everybody bring your favorite ethnic dish. At 6:45, I'm in my living room, in my work clothes, vacuuming, and the doorbell rings. The Korean students are on the doorstep with big rolls of paper towels and their food. I said, oh, hi, what are you doing here so early? My interpretation, right? They said, well, in Korea, you should go be a little bit early to be polite. Is that right? I don't want to speak for you. Culturally. I said, why do you bring paper towels? In Korea, paper products are very expensive, so we often take them as like a little housewarming gift when we go to parties. Okay? All right. At 6:55, the doorbell rings again. Who's on the doorstep? Do you know which culture? Which cultural group? 6:55. Party starts at 7. It was the Japanese. Okay, the Japanese. By then I had changed my clothes and put the vacuum away. Okay, so we get the food laid out. 7:15, the doorbell rings again. Who's on the doorstep? My student from Mexico and my student from West Africa.
Well, you lucky that you said 15. That's all I was ready for.
Okay, so the Brazilians in the South, we had a student from Colombia and a student from Brazil. They weren't there yet, but they were bringing the salsa music. Okay, we decided to go ahead and eat without them. What time did they show up?
You know that?
Of course, 7:45. That's when I realized that a 7 o'clock start time can be interpreted as much as an hour in terms of what's on time for a party. So when we are in business and we want to get the meeting going and we're paying $1,000 an hour for a teleconference call that's spanning the world, we can want to wait an hour for everybody to get out on time. But that is called time orientation. Has anyone heard of the concept of high or low context cultures? Cultures that pay attention to the context more than the actual spoken words. Ever heard of that? In some cultures, it would not be polite to speak directly your thoughts and feelings, and it certainly would not be polite to challenge things. And so the people who grow up in those indirect cultures are very good at reading body language, paying attention to the mood or the feeling in the environment. They're very good at watching political maneuvers, and they know what's going on without being told. Japan is a culture like this, and when I moved there as a young teacher and tried to find an apartment, I did not understand this. And I went to rent an apartment, and the people who owned it did not want to rent to an American. So the rental agent kept saying, "Muzakashi, Becky, muzakashi. It's difficult, it's difficult." And in my mind, I'm thinking, well, if it's difficult, work a little harder. You're in charge of getting this lease done. But what he was saying is, no, they're not going to rent it to you. So I walked out on the street with my Japanese friend, and I said, well, that was frustrating. He needs to get with it. And she said, Peggy, he's not going to rent to you. He said no. I said, he did not say no. He said, muzukashi, it's difficult. That's no, Peggy. You weren't paying attention to the mood, okay? This is high and low context. What are Americans? We tend to be low context. If you're silent, we think you agree. If you don't say it, I don't need to worry about it. Okay, we don't pay attention too deeply. If you come from other kinds of cultures, it's more important to pay attention. This causes a lot of misunderstanding. Here we have the concept of cultures that are based on the rights of the individual versus the rights of the group. You might think about people who grow up in an Italian family or maybe a Hispanic family, and the parents are trying to influence or tell the young people who they should marry. They're voting on the candidates or even dictating who you're going to marry. That's really hard for us to stomach in the United States. We see that as an individual decision. Of course, we want parental approval, but we would really get mad if grandma or auntie intervened and tried to break us up with our boyfriend. So do the rights of the individual oversee the rights of the group? And where I run into this is where those students tend to, like, you pass the test back in class, and the students from the collectivistic cultures will all say, "What'd you get? What'd you get?" And like right in front of me, they're reading my comments to each other, and I'm like, "Oh, this is so embarrassing. This is great. This is great. Put it away." Right? That's a good example of this. High-low power distance talks about the structure of your society, whether it's vertical or horizontal, and how many levels in the caste system there are. So can you think of any cultures in the world, now or in the past, that had a very vertical structure? The person at the top was all powerful, the person at the bottom had no power to impact things, and there were many, many levels, and everybody knew where they stood. Can you think-
India,
The caste system in India would be a great example of that. When I was learning Japanese, I had to learn different levels of the language. First, I had to find out, before anything, whether the person was higher or lower than me, so that I could pick the right way to say hello. So in Japan, the first thing you do is study the card, pay attention to context clues, figure it out. Ohayou gozaimasu, watashi wa Peggy desu. Okay? Can't even talk until you know what the power structure is. That's a high power distance. What do you think United States culture is? Think about the US culture. Do we have power structures? Some people that think they're better and more powerful than others.
well, it's called the military.
Well, of course we do, but do we have a king or queen? No. Does everybody of legal age get a vote? The Americans have attempted to structure a more horizontal power structure where everybody is equal, or could be if they tried hard enough, could be equal. That's kind of the way that we think. It doesn't work perfectly, but it's much more horizontal than others. So when you have students in your classroom who come from a culture with a high power distance, the students will always be respectful to you. They will not do something rude in your classroom. They will never challenge you, but they also may not ask for help. They may not be happy and they may not be learning, and you will never know it. Okay, because they are being respectful. On the other hand, if you're a teacher from a high power distance culture, and you come to an American classroom and you expect the students to be polite and not to challenge you, guess what? They will interrupt you, they will contradict you, they may catch you after class and even yell at you. That can be very shocking to people who come from different cultures, and they don't even know it. So these categories like being late or being rude are culturally based. So when I came out of graduate school, I thought to myself, this stuff is so complicated, I can't even believe that humans ever understand anything between the two of them. There's so many things that can go wrong. And I began to work on how can we overcome some of these difficulties. Our time is
12:30.
12:30. Okay.
So you're good.
So I'm talking about another 10 minutes and then we'll open it up for conversation. All right. So here are some of the things that I found in research as I was going through my master's program that I've kind of fine-tuned as I've been working in some of these special classes that are very, very diverse. And I call these my intercultural skills. And the first one is one that Nan already talked about for us. One of the most important things that you can do is slow down. Pause. Enunciate, use your face when you talk. My teenagers went through several years where I swear they did not move their cheeks for 2 or 3 years. And then when you combine that with the jargon and the speed of talking, I could not even understand what they were saying half the time. And at dinner, I would just get lost, and if I asked a question, they thought I was totally stupid. Just use your face when you talk. This is tremendously helpful. Now, that's not going to do any good if you spend your whole time facing your PowerPoint and they're looking at the back of your head, or facing the whiteboard. You've got to be able to see your face. Okay, but this is a very, very powerful tool. Even people who don't realize it are paying attention to facial expression to learn how to interpret the meaning of it. Okay? Be sure that if you have something important in that lesson that you want them to remember, look at your lesson plan. It should be at the beginning in that set activity or that introduction activity. It should be explained several different ways in the content of that lesson. And when you get to the end, there should be some sort of a little summary, recap time. Even, you can just do this on the spur of the moment. You can just say, class is going to be finished in 2 minutes. Let's take a moment and say one thing that we have learned today, one thing that we will remember. Lisa, have you learned anything today? I should put you on the spot. It's my workshop. But Lisa, can you share one thing that you heard today?
The context,
Context. Okay. Okay, so you could just pick out several people, and then that gives you a chance to say, okay, let's remember there's lots of causes to miscommunication, not just language, and so on and so forth. So you can just do that without even any planning. Just make sure you've got it in your lesson plan. Tell them what you're going to talk about. Tell them the details. Tell them what you told them. They'll have a better chance. I think it's extremely important to be visual with non-native English speakers. 80% of humans, 80% of people sitting in this room have a stronger memory connection with their eyes than they do with their ears. 80% of humans are visual learners. 20% are auditory learners. How many of you use lecture when you teach? I do. Okay? Lecture is one of the weakest teaching tools just because the predisposition of humans is it's hard for us to remember things we hear. If we see and hear it, we can remember it. If we see it, we can remember it. We see it, hear it, do it, we'll remember it forever. But if you just hear it, it may take 3 or 4 times of hearing it to remember it. So, go back through your lessons, go back through your activities, and see where you can put in some visuals or some activities so people are experiencing it. And it doesn't have to be complicated. How much time did it take me to prepare this? 2 seconds. I had to remember to go into the office and get the green cards. Okay? Doesn't have to be a big deal. Just remember, in kindergarten, your teacher taught you to show and tell. Do the same thing. I have found if I do just those 3 things, those are my 3 biggies. My international students do better, but guess what I found out? The native speakers did better too. Everybody in the room learned more, did better on the tests, seemed to comprehend what was going on. I noticed that my bullets in transferring from my Apple laptop to this PC had all changed shapes and forms.
I was going to ask
I
you.
don't know what the meaning of this nonverbal is. One thing I want to mention to you is that human expressions, human emotions, at least the major 6 emotions like fear, anger, frustration, and so forth, have found to be universal. It doesn't matter whether you grew up in an island in the middle of the Pacific or the middle of Nebraska. People can read faces and know what's going on in terms of feeling, but the body language pieces, the gestures that we use are not universal. They're culturally based. So when I was a high school student in Japan, I noticed the teacher would say, he'd be talking along and it would be like blah, 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 mathematics, blah, 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 Peggy. I couldn't understand everything he was saying, but he was going like this with his hand. And I'm thinking, what's he doing? Because I can't understand the lecture, so I'm paying attention to the nonverbals, and I'm thinking, what's he doing? What is this, Nahoko? It's counting. Okay? So when Nahoko comes to the US, Stephen stands up in her class and goes, the first thing I want you to remember is this, and the second thing I want you to remember is this, and the third thing I want you to remember is this. And in Japan, it's like this. Okay? So that's an example of gestures don't translate. So, you know, another example would be, what does this mean? What does this mean? She knows, what does it mean? In Japan, Korea, and China, this means come here. What would this mean if I did this to you? Bye.
Here, if you stop in a car, say cat.
Stopping a cab, okay? So just remember, whatever you're doing with your body may or may not be understood to what you intend. Here's the biggest thing. Don't assume that the person understands you just because they're sitting in the audience, they're smiling at you, they're nodding their head once in a while. Don't assume that they understand anything that you're talking about. You've got to ask questions, you've got to confirm, you've got to have them produce the language back to you. So if I've just given them an assignment and I want the papers turned in Sunday night to be passed back out in class Monday, I write it on the board, I explain it, and then I ask a question. Val, when do you need to have your paper emailed to me?
I have no idea.
See, that's what happens. I've written it, I've told it, and that's exactly the answer you get. So then you can throw it back out to the group. When do you need to have the email to me? And at least one person will know. Okay. So that's what I'm talking about in terms of checking understanding.
Okay, can I suggest an addition to that list?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess this would be a combination of nonverbal and verbal, but it's certainly worked well for me, and that would be humor.
Yes and no. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Well, I have found that with my international visitors, that if I can get to the point of communicating with them where we understand each other's jokes, we have made a major break.
That's good, yeah.
And even if I'm not understanding theirs completely, or they're not understanding mine completely, which is probably the case more often, at least we are communicating to a degree. We know that we're both having a good time, and it's certainly worked very well for me.
Okay. I agree with Val in that I think the more relaxed and friendly you can make your relationship with an international person, the better it helps foster that communication process. The only thing about humor that I've run into, maybe you have too, is that sometimes what one culture thinks is funny, another culture doesn't think is funny. I can remember taking a British friend of mine to a comedy show in Denver. 90-minute show, he laughed once. The rest of the audience was American. They were roaring. They were wetting their pants. Okay, and language was not the problem, but it was the cultural references being used, or just didn't think it was funny. I had that same feeling when I watched Benny Hill. I just
Or when you watch American Funniest movie, Funniest Video, there are some things that are funny,
some things.
and there are some things that I would consider as probably hurtful. Like, you know, when they're doing that stuff and sliding, I'm like, oh, he's gonna break some part of his body, and what, everyone is laughing, like, that's not funny.
That's not funny.
You know?
Yeah.
So,
Americans
you
find
know,
this to be
it's
funny.
very
Okay.
different.
But I do agree with Val. The more you can do to create that friendly feeling and get common understanding going, the better off you're going to be. All right, these are specifically for those of you who are teaching. Try to be as visual as possible, especially if you're providing a lecture. You can provide handouts. You can have a screen off to the side with just 3 bullet points on what the 3 big points are for that. It sets the context for them to hear. When I have visitors over for dinner, I just keep a pad of paper and a pencil on the table. And then as we're discussing, if we hit a joke or a word they don't know, I just use the visual aid right there at the dinner table. It helps a lot. I've demonstrated this already to you. When you ask people questions, you often have to give them think time. So this little technique of saying, write down on a piece of paper one thing that blah, 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 blah. And give your students a moment to do that. And then ask your question. Okay, and get them to share. Because they have to think of language and content at the same time. It takes them twice as long to process. And if you're a teacher who's speaking English as not your native language, or in your case, your accent's just a little bit different, you need to learn to pause and let the students in the classroom who are not familiar with that accent process what you just said. Pauses can be powerful. Use them. I like to mix the international students up in my classrooms. They tend to cluster sometimes, where they sit on the fringes so they won't have to have as close of body language contact with me. I like to match them up with people who will help them, with my permission, who will help them, or put them in small groups so that they don't have to do all the speaking. That helps a lot. End here. So, oh, this didn't come through either. That's too bad. My husband drew this for me. It's a picture of a man saying, shall we get something to eat? And he's got a fork in his image. And the person who interpreted the image was thinking of chopsticks. So obviously one is going to a steak restaurant and the other is going to a Chinese restaurant. But if you're having trouble in your classroom and you think it's your international students, ask yourself a few questions first. Have you done everything that you can do to be as clear as possible, communicating in multiple ways, multiple times, and trying to be clear about what you expect? Have you been visual, or are you just talking? Remember, 4 out of 5 people in the room are not going to catch it if you just talk. If there's something that you expect and it's different, like being on time to class, or not sharing your answers with the person sitting next to you unless you're told to, teach them that. Explain it at the beginning of the semester and you'll have a lot less trouble later. And then at the end of each session, end of each point, end of each lecture, take a couple minutes to ask them questions and make them process. Which is what we're going to do right now. As I mentioned, my business cards are out on the table. If you want to take one for future reference, please do. I'm happy to talk with you or share experiences or hear about your experiences at any time. But now I'd like to open it up for questions, and I would like you to look at your green cards and see if there's any problems or topics on that that we did not touch in that short presentation on working with people from other countries. So I'll open it up to you. Who has a direct issue or challenge you'd like to talk about?
No, I just wanted to, one thing that I do with my classes, I'm very student friendly, to everybody, of course, not only for students.
Sure.
And they can call me anytime they want, weekends on my cell phone, they can email me. And I find that this is very helpful to all the students, not only, but because there's some people work, some people have children, some people, so everybody's busy, there's student athletes, and I think that really helps everybody, because a lot of my foreign students contact me.
Questions?
Yes, and the thing about me is also remind the foreign students that I've been working with them, so I know how it feels, I live the experience, so anything you want, don't hesitate. And
That's
really
phenomenal.
helps with everybody.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. What Strauss is talking about is a concept called perceived caring. And this is what instructors or leaders can do so that people will perceive that you care about them. And the research has shown that the more perceived caring you use with a group of people, the higher the learning and the higher the results. And this works both in business and in classrooms. So this one simple action of giving his phone number and allowing them to call privately to get their questions answered, he is demonstrating perceived caring. I care about you. Now, personally, I would never do that because I would be afraid that people would call me night and day with the same question over and over. But he does it and it works for him, and I think that is a great example of just creating that atmosphere of friendliness and caring, which will raise the learning results. Okay. Good. Other comments? Mary?
Well, it does work. I do it a little bit differently. when they submit an assignment and get a really, really good grade on it, I'll say, congratulations, hey, that's great, you know, keep going, and you're doing a super job. So I care.
So that individualization, and that's why it's important to try to use names in the classroom, or if you're meeting guests from another country, sometimes it's really hard to learn and pronounce names. But anything you can do, such as name tags, or if I have a large class of students, I keep the student list right here with me. And even if I don't exactly know which phase is which, I'll ask a question like, what's the most important thing to do if you have a lot of international students in your classroom? Steve? And I may not know who Steve is, but I just kind of look up, and then when I hear, ooh. Okay. So just techniques that you can use where you're using the student names, it helps them get to know each other, and it also helps you with that perceived caring.
Yes, and then your own personal experience and story has helped most of my friends who came after me, and so I really use my experience to help them, you know, on the cultural do's and don'ts in America.
Wonderful. Sharing that information from generation to generation of
Yeah.
students that are coming, as long as it's not your speech or your
Yeah.
English conversation. I like that sharing. I like that mentoring of the new people coming along, as long as it's within our definition of what's legal. So, other questions?